joining me. As Stephen said, my name's Lauren Scheller. I currently work for the Buck Institute for Education, supporting districts around the country in project-based learning. But my background is in world languages and project-based language learning. I used to teach in New Jersey for 7 years. I taught French. And this was, before leaving the classroom, I had the opportunity to bring PBL to my class and to my students, and it just absolutely transformed the way that I taught. And I saw my students become engaged and passionate about the class in a way that I never had. So thanks for joining me today, and I wish you luck in your PBL journey. Today, as Stephen said, we're going to begin with assessing projects. So the goals for today, in the next 20 minutes, I'll discuss how the actual process of the project needs to be guided by assessments and checkpoints. And so this is different from assessing the final product, but looking at assessment throughout the project. I'll also share some example projects and focus specifically on how you would embed assessment for interaction and collaboration during a project. So we can think about formal and informal assessment in a project, throughout the process of a project. Let's begin with formal assessment. Remember how we introduced this graphic earlier in the series? So the project process follows an authentic path beginning with an engaging project launch. And then notice the orange arrows are benchmarks that are built into the project in order to help students develop their final product, presentation, or event. These are very carefully crafted in order to make sure the students have the knowledge, skills, and language they need to have a culminating event or presentation or product at the end. So let's look at, let's revisit an example from earlier in the series and consider this idea of benchmarks in a project. In this project, students are hosting an open house for the Spanish-speaking community, the local community, where they're going to present various school-related technologies in order to engage that community more as stakeholders or community members of the school. Some examples, students will be, for example, showing the attendees how to use Twitter to follow school updates or how to access the school Facebook page, maybe email teachers or log into a student gradebook, etc. There's a clear final product the students are working towards, and there's also necessary language they need to develop. So this is an overview of an example project. Now, in order to get to the final product, we want to assess students at those benchmarks, like we mentioned, along the way. And in PBLL, we want those benchmarks to be performance tasks. So if we break down that final product into its component parts, we see that in order to be able to speak interpersonally about the technologies at the open house event, students will need to be able to give directions on how to use the technology and be able to answer questions that the attendees have. Lastly, since they're planning the open house, the event as a class, they'll need to be assessed throughout the project on their ability to collaborate with classmates. So let's start with the first benchmark students will complete. Here they're going to narrate a video of someone using technology. There's lots of YouTube how-to videos. So in this project, the teacher muted the video and students had to narrate the how-to. She used Google Voice in this example where they called and left a message, but there are certainly a slew of other ways to get a voice recording via technology. Another way, without technology, is simply to have students come up individually while others are working on the project plan. Projects are great because they allow for individual attention to students in that way. So the students, prior to the narration performance assessment, worked on acquiring vocabulary and language functions throughout the week through a variety of instructional methods to prepare for the benchmark assessment at the end of the week. And that could even include GASP, direct instruction. Next, the students moved from narration to responding to questions. In this performance task, the teacher simulated a call center where she pretended to be various people calling in about the issue that they were having with their computer. For example, it shut off suddenly, they couldn't figure out how to get their printer to work, etc. Another option would be to actually bring in an authentic audience and have them ask their questions with the students as well. This teacher did not do that, but it certainly would make it more authentic. The last benchmark listed is the open house plan that assesses the students' collaboration skills. Just like the other language functions and vocabulary, collaboration needs to be explicitly taught and assessed. We can't just expect the students know how to collaborate and give them an assessment on that. We want to explicitly teach it, provide a rubric ahead of time, and continue to check in on their skills. While one large artifact for collaboration would be the students talking about the open house plan so the teacher could assess how they've met the role that was assigned to them, collaboration can and should be assessed throughout the project. We'll return to this idea, but let's first look at another example. In this project that was mentioned previously in the series as well, students are tasked with creating a website for the local French-speaking community. This teacher broke down the product into its component parts of language and skills. The skill again here is collaboration, but it could have been creativity. I'll give you a minute to review this before we move on. Here's a final example. Again, we chose to highlight here the skill of collaboration when thinking about the event logistics of the panel presentation, but we could have also used a communication rubric and focused on the skill of communication, that competency, and assessed that during a practice event. I'll give you another minute to review. So notice that the language and skills are in the middle there. So thinking about what the students are going to need to do for the final product, breaking that out into its component parts and creating benchmark performance tasks that assess the students throughout the process. So I'm going to take us back to this graphic one more time to review. Remember, we build in benchmarks in a project to ensure we have the opportunity to assess and then provide support as needed as students are working towards completing the final product. We need these assessment opportunities to be able to gather data about what our students know and are able to do. And these benchmarks in PBLL should be performance assessments and should be assessed with a rubric. We'll talk about rubrics a little bit towards the end of this webinar and in the next webinar. So as we're thinking about assessment in a project, if we think about the project-based teaching practices by the Buck Institute, one of them is actually assessing student learning. So let's take a look at that category then within the rubric, which is also available on the BIE.org website. And we'll zoom in a little bit more. So the project examples that were given use benchmark summative assessments to individually track student progress, not just the final team product. And before the checkpoint assessments, students should have a chance to practice with peers and give and receive a feedback prior to the performance assessment. They should be seeing the rubric prior to the assessment and be given a chance to use feedback to improve. Feedback should be provided throughout the project every time they're going to move on to the next step of a project or revise something they're currently doing. And these practice opportunities should be ongoing. So now that we've talked about formal assessment within a project, let's talk a little bit about informal assessment. And this can often blend with management of a project as well, because a skilled project facilitator is also a manager of student teams, and those are processes as well to gather informal assessment to help you adjust the project as you go through. So looking closely at that rubric again, we'll focus on the bullet that says formative assessment is used regularly and frequently with a variety of tools and processes. So let's discuss some of these tools and processes. Some of them are launched even at the first day of a project. So in the beginning of a project, you have an entry event that sparks students' interest and keeps them on track. A driving question is used to guide students through the process. You introduce the final product, start a need-to-know list. You'll begin to form project teams, have a discussion of expectations for teamwork within teams and as whole groups, and you'll want to have a first team meeting, which may include a team building activity, a contract, an initial task list, components like that. Project documents are also tools that help you formatively assess. So, and they also help students self and peer assess where they are in the project process. So a project calendar is really helpful. Rubrics you want to provide ahead of time. Checklists of requirements should be provided ahead of time. Students should know how they will be graded on the project. Any type of schedule, like a presentation day schedule, a resource list that they can go to. A project wall is also great to have in your classroom or even virtually, and it can include a lot of the project components and tools that will help you formatively assess and help students self and peer assess. So here's an example. This is also from the BIE.org website. This is part of a project team contract. This language can be created by students, it can be created by the whole class, or it can be created by the teacher. And sometimes it may need to be scaffolded in order to be understood if you want this to be in target language. Here's an example of a project management log with team tasks. This can be used as a tool for teachers to interact with student teams or for students on a team to interact with each other. And so you can formatively assess where students are within a project. So if you see where they are and who is completing the work, you can, when you meet with the teams, you know how to counsel them on their next steps. The need to know list is a very valuable tool within a project, and with PBLL, we recommend having both a content need to know list and a process need to know list. So that means students have questions specifically about the project itself, what they need to know in order to get to the final product. So for the technology project, they would need to know how they give instructions, how they invite someone to something, how they say all of those things they're going to realize they need to say, like computer, turn on, turn off, etc. But in the process, there's going to be checkpoints where they're going to give and receive feedback. So they need to know, how do they give feedback? How do they agree, disagree, say thank you? How do they validate somebody else's idea? And those are just things they need to know to stay in the target language throughout a project, in the project process. And so you can often leave those up throughout the entire year because they become great anchor charts for collaborative tasks for students. A project calendar is a great way to share a document with students so they know what's coming up. So if we're talking about the technology project we mentioned earlier, they know when the assessments are coming up. So you have time to check in with them about any questions they may have. They know when they're going to be given feedback. And by having a clear expectation of the schedule between you and the students, it allows you to build in time to check in with teams and check in with individuals. There's something called a TALK rubric that some language teachers use, and TALK stands for target language, accuracy, listening, and kindness. And so when students are working in collaborative tasks, this is an example of one way. There's many different ways you could do this, but this is an example of one way. You can assess their ability to collaborate and interact in the target language. And so you have these 4 categories that are really easy to turn into a score. So you can just go around with a clipboard while students are working in teams, and maybe throughout a project you're able to assess one particular student 2 or 3 times on the TALK rubric. And you can do a plus, a check, or a minus depending on where they are in that particular category, which can add up to points. And then that can add up to a grade. Now this example is a school that has very traditional grades. So they don't grade they don't do standards-based grading or performance-based grading. So in that case, you could turn this into an actual grade. But you could also make it a proficiency rubric and assess based on that if that's what your institution was doing. It's good to set up possible goals, norms during a project that supports student interaction and collaboration. So here's some examples of goals that were co-created by teacher and student. So a lot of these tools are proactive tools that are going to help students stay in the target language and will be easier for you as a teacher to move students along in the process. So as opposed to doing formative assessments and having to go back and do correction, thinking proactively about ways for students to stay connected to the project, stay on task, and stay in the target language. If you go to that link, there's a collection of collaboration rubrics. And there's different, they're organized by grade levels because they assume that your students are not learning a language, but just learning specific content. So of course we have that extra complexity as language teachers, but I gave you the link so you can look through the choices and you can customize them. So something that might be a grade 3 to 5 or an elementary rubric that has symbols would actually be a great rubric for a novice learner, and then you could keep that collaboration rubric in the target language. And it's very important that these are presented up front and students are given opportunities to be assessed in collaboration throughout the project so they can make corrections as they go along. And even till the end of a project, you are still assessing. So the last days of a project, you want to do a final self and peer assessment. You want to have students fill out a project reflection form, and you want to do some celebration. They've worked really, really hard over the course of a week or several weeks or even a year-long project, depending on the ambition level of your project, and it's important to build in time for them to really reflect and celebrate. And then this is one last time for them to more holistically assess their progress within PBLL. So this, although Liliana Lopez is not with us today, she and I worked collaboratively to create this presentation, so you can send any questions our way via Twitter or via email. And I want to just thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to share these ideas with you, and please contact me with any questions, and if you have any ideas as well, I'd love to hear them.